Hello, and welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Russell Martin and Brent Aiken. This podcast is all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring youth pastors weekly with topics that are brought to the table by youth pastors from all over the world. And now, here's your host for this week, Brent Aiken. Hey, and welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast. If this is your first time listening to us, we want to welcome you and invite you over to our website, studentministryconversations.org, where you can find all of our previous episodes, show notes, blog articles, and much more. Our goal is that you are inspired, encouraged, and the things that you hear on this podcast can equip you to be a better student pastor for the church that you're serving in. Today, we are sitting down with Brian Wallace. And Brian, I'm not going to steal your thunder, man. You tell us what you do. Just tell us a little bit about you, what you do, family, all that fun stuff.
Sure. So in my current job, I work for an organization called Pittsburgh Presbytery. We are one of the regional governing bodies of the Presbyterian Church USA, obviously in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And in that role, I wear a lot of different hats, but most material to this conversation is that I am our next gen ministry liaison, which basically means that I am the resource staff person for children and youth ministry. For our leaders and our congregations. We've got 125 congregations. Pittsburgh Presbytery, that's all in one county, by the way. So when we talk about like densely packed Presbyterians, that's us. Prior to this role, I've been in this role a little over 6 years. Prior to this role, I was an associate pastor for youth and outreach at a congregation here in Pittsburgh. So all the normal things, from retreats and summer trips and camps and all that kind of stuff, weekly youth group. So very much fit that kind of student ministry pastor role. And even for the last 5 years, I've been volunteering in a couple different roles: in middle school volunteer, high school volunteer. So I've kind of stayed plugged into the student ministry world, even though it's not kind of directly part of my job, except in the role that, of working with youth pastors, working with children's ministry leaders. Within our region. I am married. We have 2 kids. We have an 8th grader and a 9th grader. So in some cases, my main context for student ministry is my dinner table. I'm married. My wife Renee is the program coordinator for a local camp and conference center here in Western PA.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so one of the other things, and this will be a completely different episode down the pipeline, but also you do something that I just recently finished with you, and then Russell has done it as well. So why don't you tell us just a smidge about that? And like I said, that'll come in a podcast later down the road as well.
Yeah. So in 2016, I went through one of the first coaching trainings that the Youth Cartel ever offered. And in 2019, we actually started offering our own coaching training. So I am the lead coach and trainer for the Youth Cartel, and have done, I think, 6 or 7 groups who have been trained as ministry coaches. And just to give a little bit of a quick explanation, coaching is a certain approach to conversations with other people that is designed to help them determine the best solutions for them. So unlike consulting or like straight up advice giving, where you come with your ideas, coaching is a different way of going about it, in which through good questions, we help the coachee discover solutions that will work well for them. And in some cases, it's totally the wrong way to go about it. And in some cases, coaching is the best way to help somebody move ahead in ministry or in life. So do some one-on-one coaching on the side, have led some coaching groups, and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's part of what I do. And I also realize, relevant for our conversation today, is in a past life, I don't do this anymore, but in 2012, I accidentally started a small business here in Pittsburgh, where I began renting out camera equipment to different people and organizations and companies. Did that for 7 years until we were bought out in 2019. We were acquired by a competitor. So, but totally didn't do that on purpose. Never intended to start a small business. Ended up becoming kind of not a huge deal. Like, I don't want to give the idea that this is like a massive operation, but we worked with the likes of like Sony Pictures and Google and Dancing with the Stars. Like we worked with some pretty heavyweight organizations along the way. And that's actually where I learned a lot about the topic that we are going to talk about today.
Yeah, and so you said with that, the topic for today is how to experiment well, which is a really the people that might be listening to this right now might be like, "What on earth does
Yeah.
that mean?" So, what exactly do you mean by
Yeah.
experimenting well?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've observed, I have attended church my entire life. Grew up in the church. Went to church consistently in college. Went straight from college to seminary. Right. So I have always constantly been engaged in life of the church. And the thing that always stands out to me is how little variation there is in the forms of ministry that the church has, right? That churches basically in some form do the same thing. It looks different. We call it different things, right? You know, we put different taglines on our youth groups, but basically, we don't tend to prioritize innovation very much in the church. We don't tend to prioritize or even appreciate experimenting, trying new things, right? We tend to be very risk averse organizations. Churches are not known for their um, willingness to take chances on things. And I've always said that churches would rather keep doing what isn't working as well as it used to rather than take the risk of starting something new. So even if we've seen, for example, attendance at a given program fall consistently 5 to 10% per year, we rather keep doing that because at least we know that works on some level, then experiment and maybe try something new. The problem is that when you go to experiment, right, when you've been thinking about that and you're in an organization that is not favorable to risk, how do you do that well, right? It's not like you're in a startup business where it's everything's new and that's just the MO that like that's what you're supposed to do. In established organizations, there's an art to experimenting versus kind of the go-go approach in the business world. So when I was starting my business, right, I was only accountable to myself. I could do whatever I wanted. I could try it, and if it failed, it was on me. That's not how it is in churches. And because you don't have that same amount of freedom, you have oversight and things like that. Experimenting is still crucial, but you've got to do it in a way that's actually helpful.
Yeah, and so that kind of leads me into my next question. Why is experimenting important? Obviously, we don't want to be caught in those trends or those like, well, we've always done it that way. The 7 words of a dying church. But the thing is what benefit can come from successfully experimenting in your ministry? And it doesn't necessarily have to be student ministry, but
Yeah.
since we are talking in that context, though, just ministry in general, but also in student ministry, why is it important and what benefit can come from experimenting well?
So I think the thing that we often forget is that everything that we do, everything that we just expect to happen that's considered normal now, started as an experiment. Even the whole enterprise of student ministry is honestly far less than 100 years old. Where what started is basically something that parachurch organizations did and that established congregations then adopted. This whole model is maybe 70 years old and started out as an experiment. Um, so everything that we do, the idea of a Sunday evening youth group, that's very much a newer invention of the church, right? Like that's not something about like paid youth pastors. That's not something that's been around a super long time, right? Like I still know people who were the first paid youth worker that their church ever had, right? Guys who are like now retired will say, well, my first job back in 1963, I was the first ever youth pastor at First Church, right? They never had one. Um, and so part of the reason why we even are here where we are today is experimentation, right? And if we look more recently, things like multi-site churches, that was an experiment ago. It's become more common now, but multi-site was not a thing even what 30 years ago. uh, it was megachurches that suddenly realized that their reach was limited, and they said, "Oh, we should experiment with this," right? And in one sense, a multi-site model is really harkens. It's a different iteration of what denominations originally envisioned them doing, right? Of a common church with multiple locations. Now denominations are far more fractured, and like that's not how it works. But really, what we're looking at now, multi-site, started as an experiment. So some of the things that have caught the most traction in the ministry world have all started out as experiments at one point. So it's not a question of should we experiment or not. It's how we should be experimenting within our ministry context.
Well, and I guess my immediate question is for the ones that are able to look and just like you explained, I mean, pretty much everything that we do in a current context of church has been from some sense of experimentation. Why do you think that there's such a drawback and such a hesitation on still trying to have that risk factor assessed into just day-to-day things?
So I think part of it is that in an odd sort of way, churches are better at making big long-term changes than they are trying something out and seeing if it's going to work, right? And so I've seen churches who have said, look, we need a new model for Sunday morning programming for kids. Okay, fine. And what they do is that they spend a whole bunch of time like basically going through and coming up with a plan, right? And they do focus groups and they do all this kind of stuff and they come up with a new model and a new plan and they institute it without ever trying it out in the first place. Um, and they're like, yeah, like let's change our worship times to these times, and let's do these groups for kids, and let's move this class here, and they'll do everything, but they'll never try it out. And then September will come around, and that's how we're going to do it this year. And literally, the first Sunday you try it this is now the way it's going to be, right? And just to be clear, I'm not throwing shade. Like I have been on church staffs where we have done exactly that, right? And where I was the architect behind those kinds of changes, only to realize, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch here that we didn't anticipate, that we didn't see coming. And so, in a weird sort of way, in stable organizations, it is easier to make those kind of long process changes than it is to try something out. And the problem is that we really have no idea. We're working so much in the theoretical world that we have no idea if it's actually going to work. But it's almost easier to get it all figured out than to just try it once to see what happens.
Yeah. So, and as far as that goes, obviously you've had some experience on both sides, like you said. Are there any practices that you do to make this work more efficiently that you've kind of done over the years as you've had different trials and errors and trials and successes? Is there anything that sticks out that's specifically like, hey, I've found that when we do this, this particularly leans towards success?
Yeah. So I think the first thing, and this is especially like I'm speaking right now to student ministry pastors who are early in their careers or early in their settings. Um, the permission to experiment comes with trust. This is not something that if you've been in a job like 3 months and you're thinking, okay, what can I experiment with? You have to understand that like you need the system. And what I mean by the system is I mean all the people who have power. And to be clear, you as a student ministry pastor, you have power too. You're not powerless in this situation, but it's the people like your direct report, even, the people who work in the office, the people who sign the checks, those types of things. Your ability to experiment is going to depend a lot on how much trust other factors in the system, other people in the system have in you, right? And so when I'm thinking of experimentation in like my like first couple years somewhere, I'm thinking small scale experimentation, right? Small things, right? Let me give you a concrete example. If you wanted to experiment with starting a restarting or starting a small group ministry, right? You've got your Wednesday evening or Sunday evening thing, and you're like, yeah, it'd be great to do small groups in addition to that, right? For kids who want to go deeper, fine. That's probably not a very risky experiment. That's probably not something that people are going to be like, wait, you want to have Bible studies with kids? Why would you do that? So that's a low risk experiment. And that's an experiment that in your early on in a new role, you could totally take that on, right? Because that's not going to draw a lot of attention, right? On the other hand, if your experiment is, hey, I want to run a bus and take 15 kids wherever in your first summer, and there's no history of that in the church, that's probably not an experiment you want to do in your first year, right? Because you don't have the trust built up. Experimenting requires trust. That's the first thing. And you've got to assess how much trust does the system have in you, and how much of that trust are you willing to risk in case it doesn't work. So that's like the first thing is just like figuring out what kind of trust level you have. Um, you know, the example I often give was like a lot of people in the church I served in a student ministry role, I got more and more daring over my 10 years there, right? And things I did in my eighth, ninth, or 10th year that were warmly and enthusiastically received probably would have drawn a lot of question marks in my first, second, and third year, right? And that's something where people can get frustrated. They're like, I don't understand why people don't trust me. It's because you haven't earned it, right? Trust is earned. I've been in my current role for 7 years, and in my current role, I now have more trust than I did 5 years ago, right? And it goes both ways. I've learned things, I've gotten better, I've grown, right? And so that's kind of the first thing. It is like realizing that truly to experiment well, people have to trust you, and the nature of the experiments that you want to try come down a lot to, okay, how much trust is this going to take me? So to go back to the small group model, right? Some people would say, next year we're launching a small group ministry the whole year long. My first response would be, no, don't do that. Experiment with it. Try it for 6 weeks. Say to your leaders, say to your students, say to your boards, look, I want to try out doing a small group Bible study as part of our youth ministry program. And we're going to run it from the middle of October until the middle of November. So we're going to ask kids to commit. We launch at the end of August, beginning of September. We'll do 5 to 6 weeks of build up. We'll start middle of October. We'll wrap up right before Thanksgiving. And then we'll evaluate, right? How did it go? Did it go well? Did it not go well? Like those are the types of things that you can experiment with well, because then you're not committed for the long haul. Where if you say, yeah, we're going to kick off 2 weeks after our launch in the fall and go the whole way through May, you don't have any time to do any kind of course correction, right? And if it doesn't work, you said you're doing it, and now you're canceling it instead of saying, no, we did it for 4 weeks. That's it, right? That's a trial run. And then maybe you do it again, middle of January to the middle of February, and then stop. And so that's what I mean by experimenting. It's like trying things on a time limited basis to see how they go that afford you the opportunity to do some reflection and some mid course correction and change.
Yeah, and so two things that kind of popped up into my head as you were talking. First off, I would like to throw into another influence of power that you're going to have to deal with is parents.
Yeah.
Because parents have a tremendous weight of power when it comes to the youth ministry or student ministry that you're in, because they can have significant pull on how successful you are. So my question is, you talked about trust a lot. How do you go about building and earning that trust with the different types of groups that you're going to be involved in? So you said like the pastor that might be your support or like your primary response or primary person that's over you. Then you have people in your office, whether it be a children's pastor or maybe you have an associate pastor and maybe you have a finance officer or whatever. But then you have the parents, you have the congregation, you have any volunteers that are already in the program. How do you begin to build trust with those, especially if you're a new youth pastor looking to find those opportunities to build that trust?
Yep. So there are three. The first one is something that you don't have control over, but is always a factor, and that is time. The longer you have been somewhere, hopefully your trust level is building. That's not always true, right? Sometimes things happen and that trust level takes a hit, but that's the one you don't control. Is you don't control time. You've just in some situations, the best you can do is wait it out, wait until you've been there 2 years and people trust you more, and you've successfully done this trip and this trip, and people are beginning to see that you have come out of this ministry and that you are working and things are going well. I think the thing to keep in mind is that no one starts with a blank slate somewhere. So if you're coming into a new role in which the last person who was in your role had a pattern of really piss poor decision making, that is going to hurt people's level of trust in you, even if that's not deserved, right? And that's a factor that you have to account for. What is the built-in trust in the role that you have? Do they trust you a lot or not? Again, those are things you don't control, is time. The two that you do control are communication, right? And what I call lead time. So I'll talk about the communication piece first. Surprised people don't act well, right? Surprised people don't respond well. No one, like people say no one likes surprises. Truly, no one actually likes most surprises. Surprise birthday party, maybe. Surprise bill showing up on the finance officer's desk for $1,200 that they didn't know was coming, not a good surprise, right? And so that's why communication is so important in building trust. If you are going to be launching a new initiative, what you don't want is you don't want that finance officer to go to the head of staff and be like, hey, we just got a bill for $1,200 for a bouncy house. What the heck is this? I'm not approving this, right? The mistakes were, and the worst thing is that staff goes, yeah, I don't know anything about a $1,200 bouncy house. Then you're going to have two pissed off people coming into your office and you're screwed, right? Whereas if you've gone to your head of staff and said, hey, I want to do this fall festival, and here's the idea, here's the vision, here's what's behind it, and I want to get a bouncy house, right? And I just think we should buy the bouncy house instead of renting it, right? And then you get the sign-offs, you get that heads up, and then you go to the finance officer, and these are the things that you don't have to do, right? And this is sometimes where I think people run afoul in systems and organizations of realizing sometimes what you need to do to build trust are things you don't have to do, but are good to do. If you've gotten your board to sign off and your head of staff is good with it, you're right. You don't need to tell the finance officer about it. But you know what? It might be still a worthwhile endeavor to be like, hey, guess what? I just got approval for a $1,200 bouncy house, and here's why that's coming, right? Because that person then goes, oh yeah, this is that bill for the $1,200 bouncy house. We'll see how this goes, right? So that's part of it. It's just communication. Over communicating with parents, fellow staff members, and decision makers. Over communicate, right? I'm a parent now. Got 2 kids in youth group. And man, like I love communication. I love it. Now that I'm on the other end of it. And like, I almost say to people, you can't communicate too much when it comes to parents. From the time you get back from where you're stopping for dinner, like all these little things, the more you communicate, the more people think, oh, wow, this person has their act together and is organized. That is going to endear people to you and build that trust level. So communication with all parties. Factored into communication is lead time, right? So lead time means, again, building off the idea of surprises. If you're thinking of a new event and it's in 2 weeks, forget about it. Don't even bother, right? If you're thinking of a new event in 2 months, people do better when there's more lead time than when they're surprised. So good communication requires good lead time. And so those are kind of my basic things, right? Time, which you can't control, time in a position, communication, and lead time. And if you want to build that trust, like one of those things you can't control, but the other two you can. So part of it is just kind of thinking ahead a little bit, right? And so if you're listening to this podcast now, right, you need to be thinking, what's something I might want to experiment with 2 to 3 months out, right? If it's a new event, if it's trying a new form or form or expression of ministry, don't be thinking in 2 weeks, right? Be thinking in 2 to 3 months, even a year down the road, what it is that you want to try so that you get the lead time so that you can communicate well.
Sure. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. The other thing that I would throw in with that is, well, two things. First off, with communication comes transparency. You will not be a long-term successful youth pastor if you are just like, yeah, I'm handling it.
Yeah, no, you will not.
You will not go very far. And that's going to tremendously hurt any possibility of you having longevity. And then the other thing that I want to kind of throw out there, because when you were talking, this kind of thought popped into my head, and I want to kind of squash this belief because I could totally see some people doing this. Just because a church hired you does not mean that they trust you.
Oh, 100%, Brent. That you put it better than maybe anybody has ever said that. That perfectly sums it up.
Well, and that's the thing is, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of people jump into the nature of it. It's like, well, why'd you hire me? Like, because they jump into these different situations and this different, like, we're going to change this immediately. We're going to drop this. We're going to do this. And it's like, well, why did you hire me? It's like, because we see the benefit of you on this ministry. We're not saying jump in and change everything. This is not a remodel. This is not like, we're not trying to completely like gut everything from the ground up, but this is an opportunity to where they see you being a benefit to what is already implemented. and then you have an opportunity to make that implementation work and then start to modify what they already have in play to fit where you want to go better. But I oftentimes reference the first 2 years in youth ministry, Doug Fields. I quote that book on it seems like almost every single episode. But with that being said, one of the things, like, number one on the top 10 commitments for youth ministries, I will move slowly. And it, like you said, time is a huge deal, and there is nothing that you can do to make that go faster. You have to show that they can trust you through the amount of time that you're there. They want to see that you're invested. They want to see that you're involved. And they want to see that you care about the kids in the church before they start jumping into the $1,200 bouncy castle or whatever. And in the grand scheme of things, like, a $1,200 on a bouncy castle, most churches would probably be a lot more gung-ho on that than they would be like, hey, I know we haven't done a mission trip, but I really feel like we're supposed to take our kids to Guatemala this summer. I'm sorry. Like, the thing is if you're trying, even right now, if you're looking to take your kids overseas this summer and you have not started, don't.
Don't. Yeah, don't.
There are so many groups that try to do that, though, and it's like, well, first off, you're not doing, like, you're not thinking about any of the, like, road work and the mapped out process of what it takes to get kids overseas, but then also the finances and everything else. That is like a, hey, we're going to go not this summer, next summer. We're going to start talking about it now. So y'all can start fundraising. Y'all can start doing all these different things. And so like you said, it depends on the project, but I would say even the smallest projects, like you said, 2-3 months out, if it's a big change, like, hey, we're going to go on an overseas mission trip, or, hey, we're going to start a local worship service at the high school or something to that nature. All of that needs to be months and months, if not close to a year in advance of, hey, like, this is something I'm thinking about doing maybe next school year. What do you think about it? And even just planting those small seeds of, like, hey, what are your thoughts on this? You're at least talking to your pastor or whoever you're supposed to be talking to, and it allows them to start easing into that concept. Gosh, if I have done anything stupid in youth ministry, it is doing things without letting my pastor know. And then a parent coming to my pastor and being like, hey, this happened. Did you know about this? And they're like, no. Like you said, that just leads to ticked off staff members, and that is not going to make you successful in your job.
No.
So anything to add on that, or do you want to keep going?
No, I like, the only thing that I would add is basically to sum up kind of what you said, like the 10 commitments of youth ministry. I've told people that your only objective your first year in a student ministry job is to not get fired. And when I say that, people laugh and they're like, no, really? And I say, no, really. Like, your only goal your first year is for the system to still want you there a second year. And if you accomplish that, then that's the gateway that is going to allow you to begin to experiment, begin to have some freedom, because, again, it's building up that trust.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And so how, especially, so hey, you've built that trust. You've spent a year and a half to where the staff knows you, the parents are getting to know you, if not already know you fairly well. You've had meetings, you communicate regularly, all that's working well. How do you go about casting vision and mindset to the volunteers in your group of, like, hey, we're going to start this, like, I'll just use your example, the small group. We're going to try small groups here in like a month and a half, 2 months. And I really want y'all's buy-in on this. How do you go about casting that vision and mindset for experimenting to the volunteers that you already have in a way that's more than them just being like, oh crap, there's another thing that I have to commit to?
Yep. So I think there's kind of two things specifically there, right? Number one is your experiment should come out of idea gathering that you have involved other people in. So if you're coming up with something that is strictly your idea, that's not a good thing to experiment with. You need to have other people's buy-in even before you come up with the idea. The experiment should factor in other people's opinions. And so I'll give you an example here. I was, I think, 7 years in the church that I served, and the model that we had, and I inherited this model, was middle school youth group, and high school youth group met separately. And initially, they met Sunday night for high school, Tuesday night for middle school. And then early on, we moved from Tuesday night to Sunday night for middle school and high school. Okay, that was a relatively easy change. Wasn't a whole lot of pushback. Like in general, that happened early. But the model of separate times for middle school and high school was like locked in. And anytime anybody ever said to me, "Well, couldn't you do them at the same time?" I was just like, "No, that's impossible. No way, can't happen." But the thing is, what I kept hearing from parents was like things like, Brian, we love youth group and we love having our kids here. But man, we spend our entire Sunday afternoon and evening driving to and from church, and it kills our family life, right? And I would hear that and I would hear that. And so one of the things that I realized is that I had to do something about that, right? And so even at the original idea of like this specific experiment was I already had the input of other people. I already had other people's input factored into what I decided to do. I had a good reason for doing it. And that's really kind of the second piece. Like, you better have a reason for doing it. If you want to go international next summer, you better have a good reason, right? Not, well, it'll be fun, or not, well, other churches do it, right? Like, what? Why? Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to do a small group initiative? Why do you want to start a worship service at Bible school? You better have a good reason, right? There's good reasons, by the way, for all those things, but you better have a good reason for it. That's number one. And number two, it should already have other people's input. There should be a reason, and other people's opinion should already be built in. One of the phrases that drives me nuts is when I hear people say, "Well, so and so won't let me do my ministry." My ministry? It's not your ministry. It's never been your ministry, right? In the abstract, it's Jesus' ministry. But more broadly, it's the church's ministry that you're in partnership with to lead. Um, but those are the first two things. Like you better have a really good reason. You better already have people's input into the idea, right? And so, for example, if you are in a lower income community and you pitch an international mission trip, you better already have the funding model figured out, because your parents aren't going to be writing checks for $600, $700, $800 to underwrite the trip, right? No matter how good of an idea it is, if it's not contextual, it's not going to work.
Yeah, no, definitely. The other thing that I'd throw in for that is something that I've worked to establish early on in my time frame. And this is honestly something, like, even with the trust building and everything else, this is something that can kind of help build that trust. Start out with your mission. Start out with your mission statement. Start out with your purpose for what you do, and run with that, and do everything focused and lens through that thing. And so when I got here, our church's mission statement was love God, love people, offer Christ. I was like, that's awesome. I don't need to touch that. We're just going to steal it and run with it. And so we modified it for just a second because it's student ministry. And we said, love God, love students, offer Christ. And so when I bring up new ideas, or when we as groups bring up new ideas and new things to maybe incorporate, it goes through that lens. Does it allow us to love God? Does it allow us to love students? Does it allow us to offer Christ? And if it does not fit, at least in all reality, if it doesn't fit all three, we just don't do it. I mean, because it's one of those things, but that also gives you a great mindset of when you start casting vision and like focusing the direction and trying to get other people on board with maybe this idea that you and a couple others, or you and parents came up with, is if you say, hey, look, this is in line with what we want to do. This is in line with the vision and the mindset and the focus of our group. And so this is just something else that we are going to do that follows along with our mission. That is something that a lot of people will buy into very quickly, because they're like, oh yeah, well, that mission. Yeah. Like, you've talked about that for years now. Like yeah, we know that, love God, love students, offer Christ. Like, we know that. That's really, really good. And so when you say, hey, here's just another thing that's going to go in line with our mission, it's something tangible that they can jump to and say, yeah, I get that. That's totally good. It helps cast vision though. And it helps give you that, common ground, I guess, for lack of a better word, to cast that vision with. When they feel like they're already involved in the process because they know the mission statement, you know the mission statement, it's something that y'all have talked about regularly, they don't feel like they're in the dark. They feel like they're getting on the team and getting on board the direction that's already being headed, the direction that you're already heading on. So the other side of this, though, is obviously with every good experiment, there are bad experiments. Are there any downsides or things to avoid that you've caught along the way that can hinder the success of things working well when you experiment?
So I think one of the things that can really mess experiments up is when you promise people that things won't change. I have seen churches, for example, that have started new worship services and been like, look, we're starting this worship service. Your worship service won't change, right? And they mean it, but it's not true. Because then some of the people who they're used to seeing in the original worship service suddenly aren't there anymore, right? Any change in part of the system will cause a change in another part of the system. So don't lie to people. Don't tell people nothing will change. The church I serve, we started a 2-week day long summer camp program when I was there, right? And what it did is it massively changed my summer schedule to the point that like college students who normally I would be around to hang out with, and I couldn't. I was busy, right? And so don't promise that things won't change in other parts of the system just because you experiment. They will. Okay, so that's, I think, is the first thing. Second thing is, don't try and take something old and slap a new label on it and call it an experiment. Sometimes the way you try and make things more palatable to like people who are committed to an established way of doing things is by not actually changing anything and just kind of doing the same thing and pretending it's new. It's not really an experiment, right? Like it, like to think of the example that I talked about, right? Of like if I was going to do middle school and high school youth group at the same time, but really what I was going to do was just do combined youth group all the time, that wouldn't actually be an experiment, right? I would just be merging the youth groups rather than trying to figure out how to do two at the same time. So like that's I think a big part of it is like if you're actually going to experiment with something, truly make it new. Don't try and refresh something that you've done before, because then it's not really new. It's more of a technical change, right? And don't promise people that things won't change. They will.
Yeah, the only
I
other
think.
thing that I'd throw
Yeah.
to that is the mindset of, if you were in a youth ministry that was something worked well in, don't assume that it's going to work well in your next one. That is called an experiment. And
Yep.
sometimes those experiments fail because you never treat them like an experiment. You treat them as like a well-oiled machine.
Yep.
I have had so many conversations with youth pastors that have said, oh, well, we did this at this church, and so I just figured we'd do this at this church and it would work. It's like, no, like,
no.
what?
And I really have a unique lens on that, in that like my successor at the church that I serve is a near and dear friend of mine. And like we stay in regular contact, and even in the same system with two people who are pretty similar in nature, things that he has done would have failed if I had tried them. And things I did with ease, he's been unable to sustain. Because leadership change and context change mean that exactly what you said. Just because it works somewhere else, at a different place, a different time, with you leading it, won't mean that it will work in this context at this time with you leading it 100%.
Well, and that just goes to the nature of oh, well, we've always done it this way. Like, that's like, we already talked about that. That is one thing that is pretty much destined to make a church fail at some point, because you have to be able to adapt as you move on and move forward. And so great conversation so far. My last question for you today is for pastors or student pastors that might see this as a part of their ministry that is a weakness. How would you recommend that they start, or what would you recommend that they start with as far as experimenting?
Yeah. So I think the answer is you're best equipped to experiment with things you're passionate about. So don't try and experiment with something that you suck at. It won't work. One of my first experiments in ministry that caught some traction and then ran its course was an indoor floor hockey program for our middle school, or for our upper elementary and middle school kids. And that worked really well for a couple of years. Why? Because I love hockey, right? I love hockey. I didn't do basketball. I didn't do volleyball. I didn't do football. I'm not passionate about those things. I'm not good at those things. Um, if you're going to experiment with something that you are really passionate and that you're excited about and that you are equipped well to lead. I think that's number one. Number two, if you're not somebody who's naturally inclined to experiment and do it well, then probably you either need to surround yourself with people who are, or you need to go find people who you're not surrounded with right now and encourage them, right? And that honestly could be a student, right? It could be a student in your program. It could be a volunteer. It could be a parent who says, hey, I've got an idea. What do you think about? Your answer can be, that's an interesting idea. I need you to lead this, but I'm going to back you up every step of the way, right? Don't try and take on somebody else's idea. That doesn't work. It's their idea. And if they say, oh, no, I would need you to lead it, then the answer is no, we can't do it, right? But you can say, hey, I'm going to need you to lead this, right? And so let's say a mom has an idea for a small group thing that she thinks will especially appeal to girls, right? I always pick that. Obviously, in that setting, I'm not going to be the one to lead it, right? But I can say to that mom, I think it's a great idea. Like, I'm willing to help you with all the logistics, the permission slips, the registrations, the signups, the transportation, the publicity. Like, I'll do all that alongside you, right? And I will support you every single step of the way. But I think that's the biggest thing, is like somebody who's leading the experiment has to be passionate about it and has to have some knowledge about how to do it well. So if that's not you, don't do it, right? Like, don't take somebody else's idea and try it. It's not going to work. Find something you're passionate about, or find people who are passionate about an idea, and then walk alongside them every step of the way to help them give it a try.
Well, and like you said, sometimes it's just also just being able to say no. And my first youth ministry, I almost had an identical thing happen, except I had a parent come to me during a youth council meeting, and she was like, hey, so I want to do a ski trip for our group, except only 12 people can come. And we'd particularly like it to be this group of people. And I was like, no, like I can't put a number on that. Like, if we do a trip, like, anybody that can come needs to be able to come. And I was like, I cannot be like, here's half of our group, like, this half can go and this half has to stay. I was like, because that is not what I'm for. That is not what we're trying to build here. I was like, so if I totally appreciate you trying to do this for a youth event, I was like, but the thing is unless we can take the whole group, you're welcome to do a family ski trip and take those kids with you. I was like, but I cannot do that as a youth pastor. And so sometimes just saying no is a very, very big deal. And having the mindset of realizing that sometimes things that are offered is like hey, let's try this, can be some terrible ideas.
Yeah. Or very agenda driven toward a specific, and I think the example you gave is great, right? Like, is this for everyone, or is this trying to get you to sign on to their idea of something for their kids? That's a really bad idea.
Well, and in the grand scheme of things, it was like, all right, so with this, was your goal in doing this general, like specifically like enrichment and like an opportunity for the youth to have fellowship, or was it an opportunity for the church to fund half of the bill for y'all's ski trip?
Yes.
And that's what it ended up being.
Yep.
So super, super important. Know when to say no on bad ideas, but you also have to be level-headed enough to recognize bad ideas. And if you realize that that's a personal weakness of yours, you need to surround yourself with people that you trust. Maybe find some parents in the youth program that you trust. Maybe find a volunteer or two. Always have your pastor's ear. And the thing is I immediately went and told my pastor about that. I was like, hey, this is what's offered.
Yes.
I was like, I don't feel comfortable with this. And she stepped up right next to me and was like, that's fine. I totally have your back and I totally agree with you.
Yep.
And so we went and met with the parent together, and the parent was hot headed. I mean, absolutely livid that we would turn down her such a gracious offer. But it was just one of those things. It was like, look, this is not what we're about. Like, we can't do that. And I spoke to my pastor and I had their support 100% of the way, because that communication, like you said, was there. And so, good or bad experiment, or trying to avoid the failure of an experiment, communicating with your pastor, communicating with the person that's directly responsible for you, um, honestly is the biggest takeaway from this entire conversation. And I think you hit that super, super well right off the bat. So, Brian, other than that, how can people connect with you on social media? Do you have any shameless plugs for stuff you're working on? Man, the floor is yours, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, so my only shameless plug is that one of the unique aspects, there's a lot of people who do coaching out there and who do great work. One of the things that I'm kind of uniquely equipped to do is that I am trained and certified um, with the Enneagram, and I've done a lot of work with people helping to understand how their unique set of gifts and personality type fits into their ministry and helping them chart a path forward to do that. And that's something that I really enjoy doing, and I've actually, I think, shamelessly can say I've had some success working with people and helping them discover what areas of ministry they're naturally inclined to do. So in addition to just kind of general coaching, to do some of that. And part that we didn't talk about is like I have a whole background in entrepreneurship and like starting brand new things. And part of what I do is that I work with Christian community leaders. So if you're somebody who is like kicking around the idea of not just like new program, but a whole new ministry, I would love uh, to connect with those types of people and talk them through some of the ups and downs of like that church planning world, and specifically whether they have the gifts for it or not. Right? That's one of my gifts is being able to say to people, "Hey, that's a great idea, and you don't have the right skill set to lead it." Right? Like I would love to start a new church. Me personally, I would love to do church planning. I'm not wired right to do church planning. So that's the kind of stuff that I would love to connect with people on. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. Those are the two main ones. And I'll actually send a website link to be put in the description of this show as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely would recommend, as me being one of the people that went through the coaching side of it. I got to do the Enneagram, and it was really, really cool. Because it was some of the things that I was like, oh, well, I know this about me. Like, this is stuff that's like I've known since like forever. But then it kind of got into other things. It was like, oh, for example, I don't know if you're listening to this show, if you're familiar with the Enneagram. I'm an Enneagram 8, which means I shoot first, shoot second, shoot third, and then ask questions. And so one of the things is like when it got to the weaknesses side, I was like, weaknesses, what are those? Like, and it wasn't necessarily that I didn't have them or I didn't think that I didn't have them, but it was like, oh, and then I started reading them and I started looking at all the ins and outs of what makes an 8. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is something that is really, really revolutionary to even my understanding of how I tick. And it's not a end all be all by any means, but it is, like you said, it's a great tool and a great resource to give you groundwork to find ways to connect with other people. And like I said, I am a client of Brian's, so I will be an endorsement on him as well. He has tons of opportunities for you to do the Enneagram stuff through him. And all of that is on your website, correct? That you're going to be putting in the description for this. So it'll be in the show notes for this episode, but you should definitely contact him. Yeah, I guarantee you that it'll be worth your time. So, but Brian, this has been awesome. We definitely appreciate you being on the show, and such an awesome topic. And honestly, I can say that this is going to be episode 79, I believe. And out of 79 episodes, we have not come remotely close to this topic, which is super, super cool. And that's one of the beauties about having conversations about ministry and everything else, is there are so many different things that I would have never, ever considered being a topic for a podcast about student ministry. But in all reality, like, this is one that we all have a hand in this at some point in time in our ministry. We're all starting new things. We're all looking for new opportunities, and such a cool conversation. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Absolutely. And it's been fun.
Yeah. And so that is all that we have for this show. Just real quick, did you know that you can now support our podcast by becoming a Patreon member? You can go to patreon.com/talkstudentmen, and you can check out how to sponsor the show, as well as the different perks that come with being a subscriber. If you can't support us financially, that's totally fine. All we ask is that you do your part to get our podcast out to the greater student ministry audience. Share our podcast with your youth pastor friends on social media, or tag a specific episode. Maybe it's this one that you just listened to that really stood out to you. Either way, be sure to tag us in the post on your favorite platform by using @TalkStudentMen. And then finally, if you'd like to be on the show in the future, reach out to us on social media or send us an email, podcast@studentministryconversations.org. And we'd love to set up a time to where you can come on the show and be one of our future guests. Brian, like I said, fantastic stuff, great conversation, a lot of fun, and I'm excited for listeners to get to hear this one.
All right. Thank you again.
All right. We hope that you have a great week if you're listening to this, and we will see you next week.